Well, hi there, folks. I'm Dara Star Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. Thank you so much for joining me here on KJLH. I'm glad to be with you once again to talk about the issues that matter. If you have not yet connected with KJLH on Instagram, you can do that by visiting Radio Free KJLH. That's where a lot of the magic happens. You all are going to get all sorts of breaking news, current events, plus you'll be able to keep up with what's going on here at the station. You can also follow me on my personal Instagram page at Dara Tucker B. On all other platforms, I'm Dara Star Tucker. That's Dara with one R and Star with two. Well, it seems like every week we're ingesting new reality-shifting information where this election season is concerned, starting with Joe Biden's disastrous debate performance, and that set a lot of unprecedented events in motion. I've been hearing quite a few folks say, I'm ready for some precedented times. We're getting a little weary of always having to be reminded that these are unprecedented times, but this unprecedented election season was really kicked into high gear with the nation having to confront the fact that the president is in the midst of a very serious mental decline. So after weeks of uncertainty, we finally end up with Kamala Harris, and it's both a disadvantage and an advantage that a lot of the country didn't know very much about her when she took over. So she's been spending the last few weeks introducing herself to a large swath of the electorate and reestablishing her presence on the national stage with many others. And to a lot of folks' surprise, her campaign has taken off like wildfire. And it looks like they're ready to usher her into the Democratic National Convention like Cleopatra herself. And I say that a bit sarcastically, not because I'm not overjoyed at the prospect of having a viable candidate in the race, but because I don't feel like a whole lot of folks really gave Kamala her respect in the years before this. But they're figuring it out now, and I'm so glad to see it. I really am. Because we needed this sort of infusion of energy and lightness and joy and wisdom, frankly. That's what Kamala brings. I made the observation on my Threads account, and if you're not on Threads, you should be. That's been a bit of a haven for me now that my Twitter has been overtaken by bots. But I made an observation on my Threads this week that I was a bit frustrated that more people had not gotten behind Joe Biden with the same vigor. Even though they understood exactly what was at stake with letting Trump back in, a lot of us have been screaming from the rooftops that we cannot allow fascism into the White House. And I feel like a lot of folks, even progressive ones, were ready to sleepwalk through this election. But it's important for people like me to remember that people want something to vote for, not just something to vote against. And we needed to see a candidate that presented a stark contrast to Trump. A lot of people needed this anti-Trump candidate to really lock in to the election with any kind of enthusiasm. And now Kamala has added Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to the equation.
So, to those who know him best, Tim is more than a governor. To his wife, Gwen, he is a husband. To his kids, Hope and Gus, he is a dad. To his fellow veterans, he is Sergeant Major Walz. To the people of southern Minnesota, for 12 years, he was congressman. To his former high school students, he was Mr. Walz. And to his former high school football players, he was Coach. And in 91 days, the nation will know Coach Walz by another name, Vice President of the United States.
And this represents really a foot on the gas pedal, I would say, in terms of the energy and philosophy and overall conceit of this campaign. Now, there was a lot of hand-wringing over this choice. Of course, Kamala Harris had a lot of things to keep in consideration in terms of her choice for a vice presidential candidate. The Electoral College and those votes in the swing states, as Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania would have brought, or Senator Mark Kelly from Arizona would have brought. Then we had Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, who has just become such a star on the national stage and such a consistent mouthpiece for Kamala in the short time that she's been running. If you haven't listened to this guy, Pete Buttigieg, he is so good at articulating the tenets of progressive politics in a way that appeals to middle America. He's very direct and he can talk about policy issues without being boring, first of all, but without being excessively snarky or partisan even. So I'm really looking forward to seeing where Mayor Pete's career is going to take him. I have my suspicions as to why he was never really considered a front runner for VP, but that's a conversation for another day. So the person that Kamala ended up selecting, of course, was Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. And I want to talk to you about why that selection made so much sense. Now, there's been a lot of hullabaloo over the fact that she did not go with Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. And there's a lot of speculation around her supposedly not choosing him because he's Jewish. And the left wing of the Democratic Party considers Gaza to be a make or break issue. And that maybe that is why she did not choose him. Now, it came to light in the week before her selection was made that Josh Shapiro, when he was 20 years old as a college student, he made some fairly disparaging remarks about the Palestinian people, something about them being too battle-minded, supposedly. And of course, his views on America's support of Israel pretty much line up with every other mainstream Democrats, which is not something that the left embraces at all, meaning leftists. But the same can be said of Mark Kelly and of Tim Walz of Minnesota. They have the same views essentially as Josh Shapiro does on the issue of Gaza. So a lot of people are saying that Josh Shapiro, who is considered to be a rising star in the Democratic Party, would have made a much more strategic partner for her. But I think to make that assumption and to land at the cynical conclusion that Kamala avoided choosing Josh Shapiro simply because of his Jewishness is to miss something quite fundamental about the Harris-Walz ticket. If you were able to watch that first rally that took place in Philadelphia right after Tim Walz was announced as Kamala's running mate, you may know what I mean. One thing that a lot of folks have been observing about this campaign so far is how much joy it contains. Kamala is joyful to her core. She's been criticized a lot for her laugh and for coming off as unserious. I think it's just something that we're unaccustomed to seeing in our politics. It's amazing to me that she could ascend to the level that she has, having served as district attorney and prosecutor and an attorney general and now vice president, and that she could do all of that with a smile on her face. We see videos of her dancing with young kids and buying jazz albums and laughing constantly, and it doesn't look particularly presidential because it's not typically presidential. We are not used to seeing joy infused into our politics, particularly not Democratic politics. A lot of us are super cynical and we're warriors, and some of us, we done been through some stuff, you know? We're all on edge for a reason. But Kamala is reminding a lot of us to laugh. And when you saw her on that stage with Tim Walz in Philadelphia, you got the sense that Tim Walz is fundamentally the same kind of person as Kamala. He is a former social studies teacher and a high school football coach. He served in the Army National Guard for quite some time. His wife is a teacher. He's just a happy, bubbly, grandfatherly type. And I think there's a lot of synergy between the two of them that hardened political commentators and observers, they're not accustomed to seeing. Now, was there a strategy in that selection? Of course there was. We all know that this was the white guy veepstakes. We know this. There was no one on her short list that was ever seriously considered that was not a white man. And it's very interesting that all the folks wanting to call Kamala and pretty much every other black woman a DEI hire, they've never used that terminology in reference to the bevy of white men that were paraded around as viable running mates when no women or people of color were ever seriously considered. Now, we know exactly why someone like Gretchen Whitmer, who is the governor of a very important swing state, Michigan, was never seriously considered. Because who would vote for two women on a presidential ticket? And we know why Governor Wes Moore of Maryland, who is black, was never seriously considered either. Because who would go for two people of color on a presidential ticket? So for those that really have something to say about Kamala being chosen to be Joe Biden's vice president because he said that he wanted to choose a woman as his VP, then you should be in an uproar at this point because no women or people of color were seriously considered as Kamala's running mate because of the color of their skin and because of their gender. But obviously the vice presidential nominee is traditionally supposed to balance the ticket. Unless you're Trump, of course, and you find a little mini-me that's going to lean in harder to the misogynistic and right-wing Christian nationalist messaging because you think you have it in the bag against old Sleepy Joe. Only to find out that you're now running against a much stronger candidate and your little Himmler in the making is making flub after flub and showing his frat boy tendencies. So we've seen how screwing up the vice presidential selection can negatively affect your campaign, as it has with Trump's. So the vice presidential nominees matter. They do. It doesn't matter what anyone says. They do matter. And Kamala and her team knew that. They knew that she needed someone essentially from the heartland who could help her win white swing voters, frankly. Rural and suburban white men and women who don't necessarily love Trump and who might have voted for someone like Nikki Haley on the Republican side, or frankly, Joe Biden on the Democratic side. Someone who grew up in the towns of the heartland like the ones that J.D. Vance and Tim Walz grew up in. Somebody they could feel comfortable with. And let's not forget, in addition to Kamala potentially being the first Black female president and the first Indian female president, she is also what conservatives like to call a coastal elite. They love throwing San Francisco out there as if they're accusing her of being from North Korea or something. So geography matters a lot here too. There's a huge swath of the country that doesn't necessarily feel that they would be represented by a woman of color from California, even though Kamala obviously does have a very broad appeal to be a woman of color from California. I think she's done very well in that area, but they obviously needed to assuage the fears and concerns of the so-called heartland of this country. So that's exactly what Tim Walz does. But it's clear that Kamala is prepared to be a bit unconventional in terms of her candidacy, and I would assume in terms of her presidency as well. She's prepared to make some choices that don't always line up with conventional wisdom, and I think that's a really good quality to have as a president. Now, Tim Walz sort of came out of nowhere to become one of the front runners in her selection process. He helped the Democrats to lock into something that they were sorely lacking, and that is the ability to frame the Republicans in a way that makes sense for a lot of folks. I think when we're looking at someone who embraces neo-fascism in the way that Trump does, the temptation is to throw out all of these dire warnings about authoritarianism and autocracy and right-wing Christian nationalism and all of the other awful things that that man is willing to let through the door, and to think that making people aware of those things is enough to motivate them to want to vote against it. Now, as I said, I've been baffled at how a lot of folks who are on the political left were willing to sleepwalk through this election, considering everything that Trump brings with him. This would be a fundamentally different country if he's allowed behind the wheel again. But we have to accept that that's just not enough for a lot of people. And Tim Walz sort of got that early on. He started referring to Trump and his ilk as weird. And it really caught on in terms of messaging. I'm going to play you one of his quotes here that really struck a nerve as Kamala was narrowing in on the VP selection. That's the thing that really put him on the radar of her team.
Part of the reason why so many people love you, is because you've basically made weird happen, and everybody's echoing their weird. It's really taken off.
And this observation of weird came from people I know, my friends, my relatives, Republicans, that this is just awkward. They're awkward, and it stems from who's asking for this crazy stuff? Who's asking to raise the price of insulin? Who's asking to get rid of birth control? They do these focus groups or whatever. Who's sitting in a bar in Racine, Wisconsin saying, what we need to ban Animal Farm? Nobody is. So when these guys get in situations in front of real people and trying to pretend like they know what people are going through, they've got nothing to offer. And I made the pitch that I watched that rally in St. Cloud, Minnesota, where he lied about the election and lied about everything. Mm-hmm. But the thing that I thought was so joyful is Kamala Harris is going to be there to provide reproductive health care to those women who were standing behind him. Going to be there to make sure Social Security's there for those seniors who were standing behind him as he talked about nonsense. Going to be there to make sure that those workers can unionize to get a good job. That's the politics of this. Taking the country forward with a positive message on things that work, that's what people are inspired about. I'm telling you, they got nothing. What are they going to pivot? What are they going to tell us about? I'm a Legion guy. They're not talking in the Legion clubs about banning books and things. They're wondering why this Project 25 cuts VA benefits. Why would they do that? Why is Donald Trump for doing that? And you never hear him talk about it. So this is a golden opportunity. Yes, they're weird. They prove that every day. It's an observation. But what it does is it opens it up for a lot of really good people who want to know what the Democrats stand for.
So Tim Walz, a rural, older, Midwestern guy, was able to zero in on something that all of the political strategists and pundits and commentators really could not. He could basically turn on that white guy BS detector and punch back at Trump and Vance in the same language that they would use against their opponents. We know Trump loves name calling. If you look at his Truth Social feed, you know that's all he really does. The whole thing might as well be written in crayon. So I think it's been refreshing for Democrats to be able to see someone like Tim Walz kind of get at the heart of the playground politics that Trump and Vance are engaging in, and to be able to throw that right back at them. It's a good feeling. And of course, he knows how to talk about policy, as does Kamala. So no, we don't want someone who's solely interested in mudslinging and name calling, but we do want someone who's able to engage in a bit of a street fight when necessary and do it with a smile on their face. And I think Kamala and Tim are both able to do that. So I think assuming that Kamala didn't choose Mark Kelly or Josh Shapiro simply to appease the left wing of her party is shortchanging Tim Walz. I think Tim Walz is everything that Kamala needs him to be. No, he doesn't necessarily have an attachment to an important swing state. Minnesota is pretty solidly Democratic, although when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket, it was considered to be in jeopardy along with Maine and New Mexico and a couple of other safe states that were supposed to be pretty reliably Democratic. But when Kamala took over, I don't think anyone was really concerned that Minnesota might still be in play. So I think it's sort of refreshing that she chose not to do what many people would consider to be the politically expedient thing, the safe choice, because there's no guarantee that Josh Shapiro would have delivered Pennsylvania for her, and there's no guarantee that Mark Kelly would have been able to deliver Arizona for her. Sometimes choosing a VP candidate from a swing state helps, and sometimes it doesn't. It's a bit of a dice roll. But I think Kamala went with her heart here. She made the decision that felt right with her in terms of fit and synergy and overall life philosophy. And if you saw them together at that Philadelphia rally, that would be really difficult to deny. He strengthens her brand. They actually seem to like each other, just like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris seem to like each other. And I think the other thing that's not talked about enough with Josh Shapiro is that he really had designs on the presidency. Josh Shapiro, if you remember, was thrown out as one of the names that they wanted to run as an alternative to Joe Biden. Although I think that would have been really wrong to do, skipping over Kamala in that way when she was the natural next choice. But as I understand it, in the vetting process, Josh Shapiro made it very clear that he had his sights set on the presidency. Whereas Tim Walz, when he was asked that question, he said he was prepared to have this vice presidential position be the last job that he ever held. He says quite frequently that his high school students that he was teaching back in the early 2000s are the ones that really encouraged him to get into politics. He knew it was something that he wanted to do, but they provided that necessary push for him to get out there. So it's not that he's not an ambitious guy, Tim Walz. His team actually made the push about a year ago to thrust him into national politics, and it worked. But Tim Walz isn't seen as being nearly as ambitious as Josh Shapiro. And what Kamala needs right now is a partner and not a competitor. And I think Josh Shapiro would have made a great choice, but I think Tim Walz is a better one. Now, running against someone like Donald Trump, they have a very difficult challenge ahead of them, and that is focusing their message on who they are and what they want to bring to the table versus constantly being in the position of having to respond to the negativity that Trump and JD Vance are putting out there. And this, I think, can be very instructive for a lot of us. Trump is a chaos agent of the highest order. He is someone that truly believes that there is no such thing as bad press. If he has to make the news for being poorly behaved, he's just happy to be in the news. He called Kamala's race into question and claimed that she wasn't black before she started running for office. And he did this in front of the National Association of Black Journalists. And when people called him out for it, he just doubled down and started saying it again and again. His base knows that he behaves badly, and they sort of like that about him. So it's hard to point out his failures or his excesses or his negative qualities and run against that. But it's interesting when the same thing is done to JD Vance in terms of him making comments about childless cat ladies and this whole rumor about a couch. I think those negative attacks do stick to JD Vance a little bit better than they stick to Trump. Trump clearly has this Teflon quality about him that makes it very difficult to peg him with anything that will diminish him in the eyes of the people that are determined to vote for him. Unlike Democrats, Republicans can unite behind a weak candidate for the sole purpose of defeating the other side. It's one of my great frustrations with the Democratic Party because it's a very broad coalition, but it's a lot more difficult to get unified behind one person to ensure that the Republicans don't take over the White House. So for Kamala and Tim, the challenge right now is not to avoid acknowledging how awful Trump is. This man is a known entity. He was president for 4 years and he was super famous for 30 years before that. So constantly running him down is not going to be the answer. And then constantly responding to Trump's negative attacks on them is not going to be fruitful either. Just take one look at his Truth Social feed. He spews venom and lies all day, every day. He does it for a living. If you allow yourself to get caught up in the cycle of hyper-focusing on him and what he has to say about you, he will throw you off your game. He is a master of what they used to call rope-a-dope in the boxing world. Just let the other person wear themselves out trying to pummel you, and then you go in for the kill. If someone didn't understand good political strategy, they might spend a lot of time playing whack-a-mole with Trump. You all remember this whack-a-mole game from carnivals and fairs and Chuck E. Cheese. The little moles just keep popping up and you're just smacking them one after another. And that's where all of your energy is going. And by the time this person has finished launching all of their attacks, they've gotten you so distracted that you weren't able to put out any sort of proactive messaging about who you are and what you're actually about. You're just defending yourself against the accusation of supposedly not being Black before you entered national politics, or not choosing Josh Shapiro as your running mate because he's Jewish, even though your husband is Jewish, or supposedly being responsible for the border crisis, even though the border crisis predated Joe Biden's presidency by many years. So I think we can learn a lot from how Kamala Harris and her team have operated thus far, and how I'm assuming Tim Walz will operate as well. It's not that they don't acknowledge the attacks coming from Trump's camp, but when they do so very selectively and very briefly, and they throw a return punch or two, and then they keep it moving. They don't dwell on it. They don't allow it to dominate the news cycle. And I think it's been very frustrating for Trump that he hasn't been able to throw them off their game. I heard someone say that he's really struggling right now because he's not used to dealing with a cultural phenomenon in the way that he is right now. He's used to being the star of the show in every way. He's used to being the center of attention, and he's not that anymore. The people who love him still do, obviously, but Kamala is drawing larger crowds than he is, and she's in the news much more than him at this point. And it's chapping his hide, frankly. I think she knows how to use that to her advantage. Trump understands the power of free publicity. It's why he does a lot of what he does, so that he can stay in the news. But now it's Kamala that everyone's fascinated with, and he doesn't know how to handle that. I think he's honestly still trying to update his software and accept the fact that he's no longer running against Joe Biden, or Sleepy Joe Biden, as he likes to call him. Trump actually posted recently that he thought that Joe Biden was so upset that Kamala was now the nominee and that she was getting all of the attention that Joe Biden was supposedly going to show up at the Democratic National Convention. This is the wildest thing ever, you guys, and demand the nomination back and demand to debate Trump again. I don't know where he is getting his information. It seems to be from somewhere in the area of his rear end, frankly. It's completely fabricated, but these are the fantasies that he plays out in his own mind because it would be a lot easier for him to be running against Joe Biden. And he simply cannot believe that the Democrats pulled this sort of coup this late in the game and that everyone has coalesced around Kamala and now Tim in the way that they have. And frankly, neither can I. It is very much unlike the Democrats to fall in line in this way. But I think a lot of folks are genuinely excited about the energy that Harris and Walz bring to this race. And they're thrilled to have someone and something that they can vote for instead of always having to be focused on what they're voting against. What we're observing is a team that is very much ready for the challenge that's ahead of them. And the presidency itself will be its own challenge if she indeed does win this election. And incidentally, I want to let you know that I will be attending the Democratic National Convention this year. They reached out to me and asked me to be there. So they are going to fly me out and I will be reporting to you from that event. And I'm going to let you know firsthand what I saw. So I'm really looking forward to that. That'll be a new experience for me. I'm looking forward to bringing you along with me. This is going to be a wild 3 months, but I think we got this. We all just need to stay energized and invigorated and focused on our goal. I look forward to joining you all again next week at the same time and the same place. As I remind you every week, check your voter registration at the link in my bio on my socials, or you can go to vote.org/Dara to check it. Tell your mama, tell your daddy, tell your sister, your cousin, them, particularly if they live in swing states, to check and double check and triple check because people are being purged from voter rolls at astronomically high rates. Tens of thousands of people are being removed from the rolls right now. These folks are willing to play dirty, and we have to put on our work boots and roll up our sleeves and be ready to do what it takes to get this boulder over the hill, as I like to say. So be sure to follow the KJLH Instagram page at Radio Free KJLH and follow me on my Instagram page at Dara Tucker B. I look forward to meeting with you all again next week. And until then, let's learn to shout.